Well, good morning once again. Good to see you folks this morning. It's a good day to talk about evil. And I mean that sincerely, because what we will learn in the course of the day, I think, will encourage you to think in a powerful way about this subject. And there's a lot that needs to be said. Once again, I've packed a lot of information in your handouts, and we probably won't cover all of that material, but I hope to at least highlight the majority of it so that you can get a good sense of where we're going with this subject. Now, I really believe in order to kind of set the tone for a lot of what's going to be said today, that it would be helpful to go to one of the most poignant passages in Scripture in which we see the intersection of God and the very visceral impact of evil in a particular person's life. And of course, that is the life of Job. And so I'm kind of giving you a little bit of a foretaste right off the bat this morning of some things that we're going to unpack throughout the course of the other sessions, including this second session this morning. So I want you to turn to Job chapter 1. And we're going to walk through just some highlights here. We can't do a full exposition of this passage, of particularly Job chapter 1 and 2, and we're going to jump also to chapter 42 at the end of the story. And so you have this very interesting encounter in which you have three characters in the unfolding of this story. You have, of course, Job himself, who experiences evil, not due to anything that he himself did, because the passage before us makes very clear that Job was a righteous man, blameless in all his ways. And that was not just the description of the narrator of Job. It was, in fact, God's declaration of who Job was. So we see that in verse 1 that Job is said to be blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. Now, the first point that I want you to see in this intersection, and what you have here is you've got a conversation that takes place between God and Satan in the heavenly realm. And Satan appears before God, and they have this conversation. And what is important to recognize is that Job is never aware of this conversation. In fact, the only time the name of Satan is mentioned in this book is in the narrator's description of the conversations that happen between God and Satan. The name of Satan is never mentioned on the lips of Job or his friends. And so that's important because Job is unaware of what is going on in this invisible realm, this conversation in the spiritual realm that he has no access to. All he knows is what's happening to him in the earthly plane. And that's important to see here. Now, Satan appears before God, and I want you to notice that Satan is not coming to God with some sort of accusation or some sort of plan to afflict Satan or to afflict Job. In fact, God is the one that instigates the challenge. Look at verse 8, for example. Satan appears before the Lord, and the Lord says to Satan, "Have you considered?" Right? He's talking to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him in all the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil," which is the same assessment of the narrator that we read in verse verse 1. Okay, so the thing I want you to see here is that it is not Satan that is instigating Job's persecution, Job's suffering. It is God. Notice in verse 12, it says that the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not put forth your hand on him." And so Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. Now, that's the first point. Second point I want you to notice is that Satan acknowledges God's sovereign protection and blessing over Job, as well as his ultimate sovereign control over what happens to him. Now let's look at verse 10. Satan now is speaking to God. And if you look in verse 9, it says, Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands. His possessions have increased in the land. So here Satan is acknowledging that God is the one that sovereignly has provided for Job. Now, what is even more interesting is verse 11. He says, "But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." Now, that's a very interesting thing that Satan is saying, because most people who read the book of Job are thinking, Satan is the one that put forth his hand and touched all that he has so that he would curse God. And both those things are true, but I want you to notice that Satan's instigation of persecution against Job is not disconnected from the sovereign purposes of God, who also has his hand against Job. And you'll notice, particularly in this passage, the use of putting forth your hand, because it's said of both God and Satan. Okay, now let's look at point 3. Satan is the immediate instrument of the evil that came against Job, but he can do nothing God does not intend him to do. Right, again, going back to verse 12, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, therefore do not put forth your hand." So notice this. Satan is saying, you put forth your hand, God, against him, and he's going to curse you. Now God is saying to Satan, go ahead and put your hand against him. Both things are true. Both points are true. But ultimately, it is God who controls the whole situation. So, the thing that I also want you to notice in this is that this is not permission. This is instruction. God is actually instructing Satan to put his hand forth against Job. He's not saying, okay, you're allowed to do this. He's actually giving him instruction. I want you to go and do this. Now, point number 4. Job's response after all of his suffering is not to curse God. Now, this is important because what is Satan's intention? God has his intentions, but Satan has his intentions. And Satan is under the belief that if Job is cursed with all this evil, if Job experiences all this suffering, that the result of that is going to be that he's going to curse God to his face. That's interesting, because I want you to jump back to verse 5. And in the description of Job and how he handles his family, he says to himself, "Perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." So Job is very concerned that his family, and this would obviously extend to his own heart, that he didn't curse God. Right? And when is one tempted to curse God? typically one is tempted to curse God when they've experienced suffering. You ever notice that it doesn't matter whether you're a believer or an unbeliever, when you experience something horrific in your life, some sort of evil, whether it be moral or natural evil, as we discussed last night, that people, sometimes you'll say, well, Satan did this to me. And that is a common refrain. But more times than not, when evil takes place in this world, people aren't blaming Satan. They're blaming God. And a lot of people don't come to the Christian faith because of the problem of evil. And why is that? Is it because they believe that Satan's in control of all the evil that happens in the world? And, I don't want to become a Christian because then I have to acknowledge Satan. No. They don't become Christians because then suddenly they have to acknowledge that God has some sort of control over what goes on in this world. And they don't like it. And so they curse him to his face. The temptation ultimately to human beings is not to curse Satan, but to curse God. What I find interesting is that among a lot of Christians who blame Satan for evil in the world, I think it's a sort of protection mechanism to keep them from blaming God. And they have to shift blame. Oh, I can't even imagine the notion that God would be responsible for all this evil that's happening to me. It has to be Satan because God would never allow this. And it forms a distorted perspective. And I think Job really provides a clarifying perspective on what happens. It's a unique insight into how God orchestrates suffering in the world, and Satan's part of that. But ultimately, God is in control of it all. Okay, so back to point 4. Job's response after all of his suffering is not to curse God, but strangely enough, to worship him. Look at verse 20. Okay, this is after his sons and daughters have been killed. His livestock has been wiped out. His whole empire has collapsed. And it says that Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he didn't curse God. He fell down and he worshiped. Who does that? Who worships God in the wake of having everything taken away from you? Very interesting. Point number 5. Job assigns ultimate responsibility to God for the evil that came against him, but not moral responsibility, according to the inspired narrator. Take a look at this. So in verse 21, Job makes this statement, right? And this is in the context of his worship. And he says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away." You see that? He acknowledges God's sovereignty in everything that he has, including his children, his possessions, his wealth, his livestock, his whole empire. He believes came to him from the hand of God. And when all of it disappeared because God took it away from him. He doesn't blame Satan. He doesn't say that Satan took all this away from him. He says the Lord did. Notice that he says this in the context of worship. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Now, verse 22 may be one of the most important verses in the book of Job. And the inspired narrator felt compelled to say this. And I think because a lot of people, when they read these words of Job, they're thinking, what are you thinking, Job? In fact, there is a well-known evangelical theologian who made that very statement, who basically said that Job's theology, as it is communicated here in verse 21, is bad theology. Unfortunately, that theologian didn't take the time to carefully read what verse 22 says. Notice the inspired narrator feels compelled to say that through all this, through all what? Well, we could say the whole scenario of everything that took place with Job, but I think specifically with what Job is saying that summarizes what has taken place there in verse 21, namely that God gave and God has taken away. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And that through all this, he did not blame God. In other words, he did not assign moral responsibility to God for the evil that took place in his life, even though he is acknowledging God's ultimate sovereignty over it. If there is one lesson that you should learn from the book of Job, it is that. Now, jump down to chapter 2. We have a second round of suffering. And we have a similar response. Look at verses 9 and 10. Then his wife, Job's wife, she wasn't taken in the first round, only his children, says, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. Job's wife had the gift of discouragement. Notice that she succumbs. The implication is that she herself has succumbed to Satan's designs. The assumption is that she's already cursed God. Job, why don't you do the same? God is not deserving of your worship. He should be cursed. That's the temptation that we all face when something precious has been taken away from us, when we have experienced some injustice, when we have suffering due to no fault of our own, and we know that. The temptation is to curse God. And when you have nothing else left, then why not just die? God, just take my life. Look at what Job responds to her with. Verse 10, he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speak. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. In other words, what he just got done saying, he did not sin with his lips. Now, what is it that Job is saying? He's saying, should we accept good from God and not accept adversity? In other words, we only praise God and worship God and honor God and love God when good things happen in our lives. But if adversity, if suffering takes place, Well, that can't come from the hand of God. I'm not going to acknowledge him in that situation. Now, here is something else very, very important that I want you to recognize. The word adversity in this verse is the standard Hebrew word for evil. A lot of translations are a little reluctant to translate it that way for fear that they might do the very thing that the inspired narrator is saying that Job did not do. Right? Which is to assign moral culpability to God for evil, even though he is in control of it. It seems like there's some kind of cognitive disconnect there. How can God be in control of evil and yet not be morally responsible for it? That's one of the crucial questions that we have to answer when dealing with the problem of evil. But here indeed, the inspired narrator says once again, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Why does the inspired narrator feel compelled to make that statement, to make a qualifier to what Job has just said? Because our natural reaction when reading that without the inspired commentator is to think that Job has said something bad, that Job has said something stupid and wrong and sinful, because he's assigning moral culpability to God is the implication, but he is not. Right? We've already seen that he did not blame God in acknowledging that God was in control of the evil that took place in his life. And here the word evil is used very specifically in the Hebrew text. And Job is not assigning evil to God. Okay, number 6, God did not stop Satan, but in fact invites him to afflict Job a second time. Right? This is interesting because you would think, if God was unaware of what Satan was going to do in terms of all the affliction that he brought to him, you would think, why would he allow him to go at him a second time? Wouldn't God just say, whoa, wait, back up, Satan. You've gone a little bit too far. No, look what he says in verse 3. Yeah, the same conversation is just repeated. As if you considered my servant Job. There's no one like him in all the earth, a blameless man, upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. And still he holds fast his integrity. He did not curse me, he worshiped me. Although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. Wow. Now, in order for you to understand what God is saying here, notice that he is acknowledging that Satan incited him, even though God is instigating the whole thing, and inciting him to ruin him without cause. That is from Satan's perspective, because Satan has no good reason for afflicting Job, but that is not true with God. God is testing Job, and he is demonstrating to Satan that his integrity will be upheld even in the face of evil. Because God is preserving his life, his integrity, his blameless character, his fear of him, and his desire to turn away from evil. Now, turn over to Job chapter 42. So let's just look at point number 7. God acknowledges his own ultimate responsibility and yet assigns moral responsibility to Satan. You incited me against him. And there's no shame and acknowledging that there's something of a mystery going on there. That God is ultimately responsible for the infliction of evil in Job's life, and yet he assigns moral responsibility to Satan for it and not to himself. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, but I just want you to hang with that thought. Now turn to Job 42. And this is at the end of the whole ordeal. And let me just insert something here at this point. You know, you have all this conversation, and Job speaks, and his friends speak, and they go back and forth. You have all this interesting conversation that really doesn't go anywhere. And then Job finally says, I want to have a voice with God. I want to be able to speak to him and lay out my claims. Lord, why have you allowed all this to happen to me? Right? It's a perennial question. Why, oh Lord? And so God speaks to Job, and what does he do? Does he carefully explain to Job why he's caused ultimately all of this pain and suffering in his life? No. Never once does he explain any of that. What does God do? He says, Job, where were you when I did this? And I created that. And I sustained this aspect of my creation. And he goes on, and he just in great detail talks about his works of sovereign providence in every aspect of creation. And he says to Job, do you not know that I am God? And the whole implication of God's response to Job can be very easily summarized in this. Job says to God, why, God? Why has all this happened to me? And God's response to Job is simply, I am God, and you are not. And at the end of all that, we come to chapter 42, verse 1. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things. You are all powerful. Everything that you have just got done saying indicates that you have complete sovereign control over every aspect of your creation. There's not one iota of anything that takes place over which you have no sovereign control. Because if that were true, then God would not be God. And folks, if that were true, you and I are in serious trouble. Because that would mean that there is a force in this world, whether you would assign it to Satan or something else, over which God has no control. Folks, we don't want to live in that kind of world. I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have declared that which I did not understand. Things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Job here is acknowledging that God's ways are higher than his ways. His thoughts are higher than his own thoughts. And that we simply cannot penetrate the deep and mysterious purposes that God may have in any instance of evil. Later on, God restores Job's fortunes twofold. And then we read in verse 11 that all of his brothers and sisters and all who had known him came before him, and they ate bread with him in his house, and they consoled him and comforted him for all the adversities that the Lord brought on him. Once again, the word adversities there is the Hebrew word evil. They comforted him for the evil, not that Satan brought on him, but the Lord. And each one gave him a piece of money and a ring and so forth. Okay. That sets the stage for some important things. In order for us to really get our arms around the problem of evil, as I said last night, we have to understand who God is. And too often we have these paltry, anemic, weak, feeble notions of God. And we bring God down to our human level of understanding, and we even assign to God a kind of human-like set of characteristics because we fail to understand that God is far greater than our puny minds can even imagine. And so we have very small little gods that we construct in our minds when we think about who God is. And as a result of that, we cannot really come to grips with understanding who this God is in relation to his creation and his creatures and everything that unfolds in that creation, including all the events of history and of our personal lives. And if we're ever going to have a full appreciation for the wonder and the majesty and the glory of God, we have got to cast aside our feeble visions of who God really is. God is holy. Number one, we're in the book of Job. I want you to turn briefly to Job chapter 11. These are the words of Zophar. Not everything that Job's friends said to him was bad. They gave him a lot of dumb advice and misconstrued much of what happened to Job, but sometimes they make pretty good statements, and this is one of them. Verse 7, can you discover the depths of God? I love how the English Standard Version translate this. Can you discover the deep things of God? Can you discover the limits of the Almighty? They are high as the heavens. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. What we have here is a vision of the transcendence of God. What does that mean? That means that God, as God, stands above his creation. Theologians make a very, very critical, important distinction between what we call the Creator and the creation. Radical distinction between the Creator and the creation. The Creator is not the created. And we, as the creature, are not the Creator. There's an unbridgeable gap in many ways between the creature and the Creator. Now, that doesn't mean that God is absolutely transcendent. That's actually what Islam believes about Allah. And by that notion, if God were absolutely transcendent, then it would also mean that he's completely unknowable, and that is not true. So we believe because of God's transcendence that he is incomprehensible in the fullness of his being, but that does not mean that he is unknowable, right? Because the Bible tells us that God has created us in his image and that we are reflectors of God in many ways, though in very finite kinds of ways. So we believe in both the transcendence of God, but also the immanence of God. In other words, the word immanence has this notion that God comes near to his creatures. And he has done that primarily and most powerfully through his Son, Jesus Christ, who became incarnate, took upon himself human flesh so that he bridges that gap between creator and created, because Jesus is fully God, but he also took upon himself the fullness of humanity so that he is fully human. That, folks, is mind-blowing. So when we speak of God as holy, this is number one, the Holy One, under understanding the greatness of God. When we understand God as holy, there's two senses in which we think of the holiness of God. One is the holiness of God in terms of his righteousness, of his white-hot righteousness that nothing can touch. He is pure, unadulterated righteousness. Not a hint of sin or evil can be found in his being. It's not even remotely possible that such could be associated with God in his essence. But there's another sense in which we speak of holiness that has more this idea of God's transcendence. And there are certain unique attributes of God that are associated with his godness, if you will, that distinguishes him from everything else, right? In this sense, God is in a category all by himself. What are some of those notions? Well, first of all, he is self-existent, right? He had no beginning. He has no end. He's not a created thing. God is eternally uncreated because he is self-existent. He is self-sufficient in himself, right? This means he is also independent. God does not depend on anything for his own existence, for his own self-sufficiency. This also means that he is infinite, boundless in his being, and perfect. God can never be any greater than he is, nor can he be any less than what he is. There's no fluctuation in the perfections and infinite quality of God. He is a simple God. What does this mean? It means that God is not composed of parts and pieces that you kind of put together like a puzzle, right? Because then that would suggest that there is these separate entities that have their own substance and existence, and gets kind of philosophical, and you put all these things together and that composes God. No. God is a simple unity. Everything that is in God is God. And he can be identified with his existence and his attributes as God. They're not things that he just adds to himself. In the Platonic notion, there's this idea of power or wisdom or love. And somehow God takes a little bit of love and a little bit of wisdom, a little bit of power, and he brings that to himself, and there you have God. No. God is love. God is wisdom. He is power. All these things are God, and they're all necessary to his existence. And this also means that we can't sort of isolate certain attributes of God and think that they're greater than other attributes of God. And this is a failure that a lot of Christians fall into, an error in which they, for example, exalt God's love as the supreme attribute of God. Or, on the other hand, you might exalt God's power as that is his supreme attribute. No. They're all supreme. And they're all present within God all the time. It's not as if God is more loving or less loving in any instance of his existence, or that he is more powerful or less powerful in any instance of his existence, because he is all those things fully all the time. He is timelessly eternal. Time as we experience it as a succession of moments, with past and present and future, that's meaningless to God. He transcends that construct that we call time, and we can't even grasp that. It's mind-blowing that God doesn't exist in a succession of moments like we do, because we're finite creatures and he is infinite. He is immutable. Right? God does not change. And I've already suggested that with other things I've just said. He is omniscient. He knows everything. There's nothing that escapes his knowledge, because he's the very fountain of knowledge, of knowing, of understanding, of wisdom. He is omnipresent. He is present everywhere. No place escapes him. And this goes with his knowledge. No knowledge escapes him, because he's everywhere. He knows everything. He is omnipotent. Everything that is possible that God can do, he can do. That doesn't mean that God can do some things, like God can't do evil. God can't make square circles, right? Because those are illogical. They're irrational, and God is a rational being. So his power corresponds to all of his other attributes. And that's important, because God's not capricious. Do you know what I mean by that? He doesn't just act willy-nilly. I've got all this power, I can do whatever I want. No. God always acts and demonstrates his power in accordance with the fullness of all the rest of his attributes, so that God can never contradict himself in anything that he does. And then, of course, finally, he's incomprehensible. The depths, as Zophar says here in Job 11, the depths of the Almighty and his ways are impenetrable. We could never fully grasp this transcendent God. And this plays into other aspects of God, particularly when we think of his sovereignty. I want you to turn to Isaiah quickly. I'm going to look at two passages, and again, I'm skipping over some material here because I want to drive home a couple of important points. Look at Isaiah chapter 46, if you will. Isaiah 46. And look at verse 9. Isaiah 46, verse 9. God is speaking to the prophet, and he says this. He says, remember the former things long past, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me. Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. Now let's stop for a moment. I want you to notice that in these statements that God is grounding his sovereignty in the majestic, incomprehensible, transcendent uniqueness of his godness. You can't treat God like he's just some, other being that we're familiar with. He's beyond all that. And we don't want to trivialize the nature of God by bringing him down to our level. Now, I want you to notice also that he says, my purpose will be established, declaring, he's declaring ancient things, things that have not been done, and saying, my purpose will be established. In other words, he is demonstrating that he's got a plan that includes all things, and that he's got a purpose. He doesn't just act willy-nilly. And notice that also that this purpose of his is his good pleasure. He has a good purpose, not an evil purpose. Verse 11, he gets specific now. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my purpose from a far country. Truly I have spoken, truly I will bring it to pass. I have planned it. It is surely I will do it. This is all comprehensive. God is not just saying, I'm going to do something. I have a purpose with a few things in this world, and the rest, I don't know about. They're just going to happen, and this is going to be the way it is. No. You can't assign something that takes place in this creation or in history to some nebulous notion of fate. That's pagan. It's not Christian at all. If God has not planned everything, then who has? That's not a Christian notion at all. It's not a biblical idea whatsoever. Now turn over just a page earlier to Isaiah chapter 45. Similar statement in verse 5. Notice again, God is speaking. He says, I am the Lord. I am Yahweh, right? Identifying himself with his sacred name, this mysterious name that he gave to Moses that no man knows. In fact, the Jews wouldn't even pronounce it. So we're not even sure that the pronunciation of Yahweh is correct. We just don't know. Because the Jews, very early on, refused to pronounce this name because they understood it to be so sacred that we don't want to say the name. They even called it that. They called it the name. Now, we don't need to go that far because God has revealed that to us. We know that he's revealed himself as the great I am. which is where we get this sacred name of God, Yahweh, or in the Greek transliteration, Jehovah. It says, I am Yahweh, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I will gird you, though you have not known me, that men may know from the rising to the setting of the sun, right? And the whole comprehensive aspect of the creation and the cycles that I have set forth as the Creator, that you may know in the fullness of your experience in the created realm that there is no one besides me. I alone am God. I am the Lord. There is no other. He keeps repeating this. Why? Because he wants us to know that he is unique. You can't compare him to anything else. You can't bring him down to the familiar, the common, and any notions that we have, any sort of common, mundane, everyday kinds of comparisons that we might draw between God and us as creatures. You can't go there. And if you do, you'll never understand what God is really doing in this world. Specifically, what he gets ready to say in verse 7. The one forming light and creating darkness, causing well-being and creating calamity. I am Yahweh who does all these. Now, there's a couple of interesting things here in verse 7, and these are unique Hebrew ways of speaking. Number one is parallelism. This is very common in Hebrew thought, which is to repeat the same notion with different words, different phrases. So you see that in the first line, I am the one forming light and creating darkness. That's the first one. And then you have a parallel phrase where he says causing well-being and creating calamity. That's parallelism. Now you also have something called merism. Merism is the idea that you take one extreme and contrast it with the other extreme, and the idea is that these things represent the totality of everything. So it's not just the extremes, it's everything in between that is being indicated. So when God says, I am the one forming light and creating darkness, that means that he is behind the formation and the existence of everything from the spectrum of light to the spectrum of total darkness. And then to take it from that sort of abstract notion and make it a little bit more concrete. In the second line, he says, creating well-being and creating calamity. What is the word calamity there? It's the same word we encountered in the book of Job that was translated in the New American Standard Version, which is what I'm using, as adversity. Here is translated calamity. It's the same standard Hebrew word for evil. God is causing. God is determining. God has sovereignly determined both everything for well-being and everything related to calamity, evil. Now, what is also very interesting about this verse is that the word creating in both lines, which incidentally is connected to the word darkness as well as to the word calamity or evil, is the Hebrew word bara. And that word in the Old Testament is only used in connection to God. It's the same word, for example, that we read in Genesis 1:1 when it says, in the beginning God created, God barad the heavens and the earth. That word bara is never associated with human creative activity. There's another word that is often used in creation with God, which is usually translated God made. But that word in Hebrew can also be used of human beings. This word, bara, is only used of God. Now, some people, if they're not careful, might misinterpret what this means. Does this mean that somehow God created evil? No. It's a unique way of saying that God has ensured that everything that unfolds in the course of his creation is going to unfold precisely according to his plans, and that happens to include evil. And the reason why we qualify that is because Scripture always interprets Scripture, and we know that when God created the world, what did he say regarding the world? He said it was good. Not only was it good, but he said it was very good. It is perfect. It is sinless. There is no ounce of evil in this created realm. That's important. Okay. Now, we're going to take a break here in a moment, and we're going to continue with this. We may not get to everything this morning, but let me just finish a few thoughts here, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back again. God is the transcendent author of all. I believe that there is a good model for us to help understand God's sovereignty in this world. And sometimes we have a strange notions about God's sovereignty that is almost more akin to either deism, which is false, or some other strange notion about how God exercises his power and providence. One, and this is more the deistic idea, is like a domino maze. You ever see those videos where people are set up these elaborate mazes of dominoes, and they wiggle all around a big room, like a big gymnasium floor or something. And then you have the guy that just knocks that first domino over, and then boom, 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 and then they all fall down, right? And so it's like the chain reaction. So a lot of people have this idea that God's sovereignty is like he's the first domino, right? He's the first one, or he's the one that pushes that first domino, and then it all weaves and it all just kind of goes its way. It's very sort of cold and impersonal and lacking any sort of notion that God has any freedom in what he does at all. And it's just like this chain reaction, boom, boom, boom. It's really more akin to what is known as fatalism. That whatever happens will happen, and it doesn't matter how we act as human beings. That's false. I'm talking a little bit about that more later. Or you have this other notion of God as like some kind of grandmaster chess player, right? You see these great grandmasters, they go into a room and you've got like 8, 9, 10 tables, with these really great chess players, and this guy goes and he makes his move, and then he moves to the next table and makes the next move, and he's just constantly, outmaneuvering his opponents. Like God doesn't really know what somebody's going to do, but he's anticipating some of their moves, and then he kind of outmaneuvers them. No, that's not the picture that the Bible gives of God's sovereignty. I believe a better picture is that God is like a transcendent author. He is like a Dickens or a Tolkien or a Lewis, C.S. Lewis, right, who has crafted a whole story, and he's created every detail in that story, including the good and bad characters, the whole plot, everything. He has written the whole thing out. And I believe that's a better picture of God's transcendence and sovereignty. Okay, it's 9:45. We only got about halfway through this first session. I'm going to move quickly. We're probably going to look at still some things from session 2 and then move on to session 3 because we've got a lot to cover. But again, some of these early things, I'm spending a little more time on them because they're so foundational. If we don't get the foundation right, anything else that I say later is not going to really make sense, because the foundation has got to be there. Our theology has got to be rock solid before we can really begin to understand the problem of evil and what the Bible really says about it.